Well, welcome everyone. It is good to be back with you to talk about another aspect of parental estrangement. We're going to talk about the role of a difficult daughter-in-law in particular. Sons-in-laws can also cause a lot of problems for parents and create estrangements. But today I'm going to be focused on the daughter-in-law for reasons that'll become clearer as I speak. Typically, whenever I give a talk and ask the audience about kind of how many of them believe that their estrangement is in part related to their relationship with their son-in-law or daughter-in-law, the vast majority, well, first of all, a significant percentage raise their hands and say that they believe that it is. Um, and when I ask, is it much more likely to be the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law? Typically, 3 out of 4 times it's the daughter-in-law. So there's a number of different reasons that I'm going to hopefully drill down into to give you context. Now, when I first started working in this field, I wrote my first book on estrangement in 2007 called When Parents Hurt, Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along. And I don't think I even had anything in there on the role of the son-in-law or daughter-in-law. It just wasn't as much obvious to me the role that a difficult relationship between the parents and their spouse, how much a difficult relationship could lead to an estrangement. But since that time, I've done webinars, I wrote my second book, I've done research articles, I've done a Q&A every Monday or every other Monday for estranged parents for the past 12 years. I've been on numerous interviews and podcasts and in the media all the time. And I'm really seeing how common it really is. So the other thing that I found in my survey of 1,600 estranged parents to the University of Wisconsin Survey Center was that something like 70% of estrangements happened after the child got married. And a significant percentage of those seem to be in response to some kind of conflict with the son-in-law or the daughter-in-law, particularly the daughter-in-law. So I'd like to start with a case study. And whenever I do a case study, it's been I'm using what we call in my field composites, meaning it's not just one person, it's a number of different people kind of blend it all in together. So I'm not actually giving away anybody's confidentiality, but you may well recognize yourself or your family in this dynamic. One of the things parents say to me all the time is, I feel like you were writing that about me. And that's because there are really only so many different permutations or scenarios when somebody does become estranged. So I want to start by talking about Sam and Maria, but before that, I want to give a quote from Elena Ferrante's excellent book, My Brilliant Friend. And she's talking about a friend of hers who got married that I think really encapsulates this dynamic. And what she says is when she went to change, when she came back from the wedding, dressed in her beautiful traveling clothes, when she handed out the wedding favors, when she had left with her husband, then a huge fight would erupt. And it would be the start of hatreds lasting months, years, and offenses and insults that would involve husbands, sons, all with an obligation to prove to mothers and sisters and grandmothers that they knew how to be men. So what Ferrante is putting her finger on here is what I call performative masculinity, which is a kind of masculinity that I see a lot in the estranged families that I work with, where the once kind of kindly or sweet or involved husband has to really demonstrate that he's strong and he's a man to his wife by taking on his parents, rejecting his parents, scolding them, criticizing them, etc. Now, this isn't to say that sometimes the parents don't deserve it or have it coming. It isn't like there aren't parents, who make things difficult, who are too critical or too intrusive or too involved. But it's the role of the son that I'm particularly interested in how this all plays out, because I think it reveals a lot about the state of the sexes these days. So I'm going to give an example of a family that's generally the kind of family that I see. So when Sam brought Maria home from the first time from college, she did not make a good impression on the family. Spent much of the evening on the couch texting on the phone, barely engaging in family members in conversation, including Sam's two sisters with whom he was very close. Sam seemed a little embarrassed by her behavior, but he was also careful not to pressure her into more involvement in the family interactions. Well, she's just shy, I think, said Sam's mother to her husband and daughters after the first meeting. You know, we're kind of a loud, overwhelming family. She was an only child. Isn't that what Sam said? I think we just need to give her time to get to know us. Sam seems happy with her, and that's all that matters. Well, I think she's a jerk, said Sam's younger sister, Sarah, a high school senior. Seriously, I must have asked that girl 10 questions about her college studies, her hobbies, her family, where she grew up, whatever. I hope she makes Sam happy, but I'm just not willing to work that hard to get to know somebody. Did she even ask you one question, Mom? Mother said, no, but that's okay. She probably just needs time to settle in. I think, if she makes him happy, then I'm fine. She doesn't have to be my best friend. Besides, she's his first serious girlfriend, so it's not like he's necessarily going to marry her or anything. Oh, God, I hope not, Sarah said, because I know girls like that one, and this one is bad news. Trust me. Well, Sarah was right, and her mom was wrong. Within 1 year of their dating, Sam had cut off all contact with his parents, sisters, grandparents, as well as his childhood friends. Everybody. Like many of these cases, the deterioration in the family relationship occurred over a surprisingly short period of time, a trail of small misunderstandings and mystifying communications construed by Sam's girlfriend and then Sam as her stalwart defender as intentionally hurtful, hostile, and manipulative on the part of Sam's family. Visits with Sam and Maria always ended with a furious phone call the next day, where Sam would yell at his parents with for disrespecting Maria and, quote, just not getting it. When Sam's mother asked Maria if she had planned to have children, Sam told her that Maria was incredibly insulted by that and found it incredibly intrusive. She also said she didn't like Sam's mother's cooking, so she didn't want to have dinner there again. What surprised Sam's family and later friends was a dramatic change in Sam's personality. He'd gone from somebody who was friendly and outgoing to cold and hostile. What's like she's overtaken his mind, his dad told me in my first meeting. And the more we plead with him, the more he moves away. We tried reaching out to her parents, but they had no interest in helping us, acting like we were just being mean to their daughter. It seems, we said, look, we're just trying to get our kid to talk to us. It seems like ever since they've been together, he wants nothing to do with us. We just don't know what we've done. But they just acted like it wasn't their concern and like we had been mean to their daughter, even though we hadn't whatsoever. We're happy to apologize to her if that's what it takes, but they didn't even seem willing to help us do that. So it's apparent they're in contact with them, though, because we're all still have access to his Facebook page, and we're seeing all the wonderful activities that they're doing together without us. So this sequence with Sam and Maria's family is very common in my experience. Adult-child couples with somebody who's either troubled or highly insecure. She feels threatened by his attachment to his family or friends. Slowly, she encourages the dissolution of any and all prior relationships until the only attachment is to her and not infrequently her family. So in my clinical experience, it's not uncommon for a daughter-in-law and sometimes a son-in-law to act like a powerful cult leader. That's why I'm calling this webinar A Cult of One, enforcing absolute obedience from, in this case, the son-in-law. There's a kind of a brainwashing that occurs. And one of the most potent methods of brainwashing is persuading the adult child that his or her parents are bad, if not outright evil. So while it's not hard to see how that kind of manipulation would be easily achieved in those homes where the parent truly was abusive or dysfunctional, and those exist, this method can be remarkably successful even in highly functional homes, especially where the parent and child, particularly son, enjoyed a once close relationship, particularly a mother-son close relationship. Now, doesn't that mean there were significant problems hidden in the relationship between the parent and the adult child, ones that the new spouse is just simply shining a light on or playing to their advantage, or rather than playing to their advantage? Well, sure, sometimes. But I don't believe that hidden problems explain the majority of these kinds of estrangements. I would argue that almost any child, sons in particular, are vulnerable to that kind of manipulation when faced with an extremely troubled, controlling spouse. For example, a troubled or manipulative spouse can persuade the adult child that they have repressed memories of how bad their childhood was, including repressed memories of abuse, that they're overly dependent on the parent and need to stand up more for themselves or for the spouse who's supposedly being abused or mistreated by the parents. To that end, the manipulative spouse is likely to inflate any kind of the normal slings and arrows of family life into a severe and unacceptable character flaw of the parent that not only cannot be tolerated, but should not be tolerated. Where any positive contact with the parent or anybody related to the parent has to be reinterpreted as negative in order to forestall their power to influence the adult child away from their troubled spouse. Now, it's interesting. I call it a cultural one because it's interesting how similar these traits are to those commonly observed in members of a cult. For example, sudden, here are some characteristics that are common in cults. Sudden or dramatic changes in personality or belief system. Rewriting history as bad or abusive. Use of language that seems coached out of character. Sometimes parents will write me and say, it's clear my kid didn't write that letter because they don't talk like that. Rejection of parents, siblings, and anybody else close to them. Rejection of anything related to the past, such as childhood, cherished childhood objects. Black and white thinking, always, never. Radical changes in life plans. Secrecy, dogmatic belief systems. As Stanford researcher Philip Zimbardo wrote about quotes about cults, a remarkable thing about cult mind control is that it's so ordinary in the tactics and strategies of social influence that are employed. They are variants of well-known psychological principles of compliance, conformity, persuasion, dissonance, emotional manipulation, and others that are all used on all of us daily to entice us to buy, try, donate, vote, join, change, believe, love, hate the enemy, etc. Cult mind control isn't any different in these kinds from these everyday varieties, but in greater intensity, persistence, stakes, duration, and scope. In other words, we're all vulnerable to being manipulated to behave in hurtful or problematic ways when given the right sense of circumstances, particularly somebody who's highly manipulative. One of the traits of highly manipulative people is the ability to both consciously and unconsciously know what people need in order to feel good. If their partner had insecurities about intelligence, for instance, they'll make him or her feel really intelligent. If they're insecure about their potential for success, they'll make them feel like their potential for success is limitless. If they feel unattractive, they'll make them feel like they're highly attractive, but could be even more so. On the one hand, they speak to the pain of those feelings of inadequacy while promising subtly or overtly to make all that pain go away. On the other hand, they can manipulate them by playing on those same insecurities, by wounding them, criticizing them, threatening to leave them. So let's return to Sam and Maria for a minute. So when a new spouse or romantic partner is an active and highly empowered agent of estrangement, it's important that estranged family members accept, this is critical, that he or she is the new alpha, and therefore the gatekeeper to any future contact with your estranged adult child or your grandchildren. So what I said to the parents, as I commonly say to parents, is you can't go around her, you can only go through her. Therefore, you can't criticize his wife at all, no matter what, either to her, certainly, but to your son, because she can and will use that against you in the court of your son, where you are currently guilty until proven innocent. You also can't establish an independent line of communication with your son because she'll feel too threatened by it. Now, occasionally I'll work with parents where the son is allowed to have contact with the parents, but the grandchildren can't, and the wife doesn't want anything to do with them. But still, the same rules apply, that anything critical said about the spouse will very likely be repeated to them, and it will very definitely worsen your case. So I encourage Sam's parents to view Maria as fragile rather than intentionally divisive. I said, your attitude about her matters because the emotions that are generated by your feelings of fear and loss are most likely to get you to overreact or get aggressive or get all emotional on your child or her. So that's exactly the opposite of the place that you want to be. It's better to think of a troubled spouse as having a bomb attached to your child, who's all too willing to connect the detonation wires if you come at her too hard or even too fast. So some degree of caution, even compassion, will allow you to slow down and approach with a kind of respect and restraint the situation requires. And as I did hear more about Maria, it was clear that she did suffer from acute social anxiety, the kind where interactions with almost anybody are excruciating because of the fear, self-doubt, and self-recrimination that they can produce. So being brought into a loud, extroverted family like Sam's, where people are both intimate and opinionated, was nothing short of terrifying to Maria. So while she might have appeared self-centered and cold as she sat on the couch texting, likely she was trying to soothe the panic that was welling up inside of her. So her later attempts to vilify Sam's family, however problematic, were attempts to justify her need to shield herself from situations that triggered her anxiety. Her desire to have him cut off contact with them was also a way to control her fears and ward off the family's potential, however unlikely, to influence Sam against her. Now, isn't to say she was any walk in the park to be around. Sometimes the defenses developed to reduce anxiety can make those people who have those issues intensely difficult, prickly, or both. In addition, people who have Maria's personality don't need a lot to conclude that they should be, other people should be rushed to the trash compactor. So also, knowing the reasons that somebody behaves in a difficult and provocative way doesn't necessarily mean that that understanding provides a definite path to reconciliation. So, as I do with almost all parents, I encourage Sam's parents to write a letter of amends to both Maria and to their son. Not because I thought that they would necessarily soften Maria, nor because I thought they had done anything particularly wrong, but rather I hope that this would strengthen Sam, their son's ability to modify her intransigence. So from my perspective, the primary cause of the estrangement, as it often is, was loyalty to her and fear of her disapproval and rejection. The more the parents could just acknowledge her power and centrality in his life, the more the parents could say, look, I think my parents get it and are really trying. Let's give them a chance. Otherwise, she can just use it all against them. She can just say, well, your parents aren't even trying with me, or they never apologized to me, or they haven't shown any willingness on their part to really see it from my perspective. So the more that they could position themselves as unthreatening to her by accepting her boundaries, however strict or unreasonable they seemed, the safer she might feel to have contact. The more the parents criticized her, by contrast, the more empowered she would be. Remember that your criticism is the troubled daughter-in-law's or son-in-law's superpower, because then they can claim that you are dangerous to their mental health, their happiness, their security, their safety. Therefore, you are hurtful, toxic, and dangerous. But so why would Sam have to change his personality? I mean, couldn't he just kind of go with the program to make her feel reassured, but not actually change his personality? I mean, a lot of parents have said to me that their once sweet child has now taken on the personality of their troubled romantic partner. So sometimes this observation reflects a need to blame the new husband or wife for changes that the adult child may have always wanted to make. So in that sense, the spouse here is being wrongly accused. For example, where their child longed to be less available, more assertive, or more verbal with their complaints, and the spouse freed them to do so. But it's also true that sometimes our people are transformed in their marriages in negative and hostile ways. And I think this occurs and as an attempt to resolve what the sociologist Leon Festinger in 1957 referred to as cognitive dissonance. If you ever took an intro psychology class or sociology class, you probably learned about it. Festinger wrote that we're all powerfully driven to experience ourselves as consistent in our thought processes. As a result, if we become aware of an inconsistency in our beliefs, we'll change one or more of those beliefs to make them more internally consistent. So how might a theory of cognitive dissonance explain why Sam changed from being a kind and considerate family member to being critical and angry? Well, here's how the shift in personality might work. Belief one, my parents and sisters are good people who deserve my love and respect. belief. Two, Maria hates my family and thinks they brainwashed me into thinking that they were good to me when they really weren't. Now, since Sam loves both his family and Maria, he is in a quandary. If he remains committed to Maria, he'll produce endless fights by disagreeing with her or pushing her into being more involved with his family. She has already said she doesn't like them and doesn't feel comfortable being in their presence. He will also feel guilt towards Maria if he remains in contact with them, as she's made it clear he needs to choose her over them, and being close to them is therefore a betrayal of her. Since Sam has to come home to Maria each night, not his parents, his path of least cognitive dissonance is to accept his version of his parents as the correct one. In taking on her behavior, he further lessens the dissonance because he reduces the notion that her behavior is wrong. He also avoids having to deal with ongoing feelings of guilt, sadness, and regret toward his family. It's his way of saying, well, of course, Maria's treating you terribly. I am too. That's what you've created. Maria is right and you're wrong. So why do I say that and find that men are more vulnerable to this? Well, there's a number of different reasons. In general, the research in sociology shows that men tend to have less conflict about being less involved with their families than do daughters. There's what sociologists refer to as the matrilneal advantage, meaning that when men get married, they're much more likely to be kind of absorbed into the wife's family, or even if the daughter-in-law isn't close to her family, she's much more likely to exert much more influence, and probably because men tend to have somewhat less guilt or less conflict about staying close to their parents. Men are really easy to manipulate around their masculinity. If a woman were to say, well, you're a mama's boy, or, you need to protect me and stand up for me and my needs, and this is our new family, and you need to stand up, protect me more. There are very few men that wouldn't be vulnerable to that kind of argument. I'm sure there are plenty, but there are plenty, perhaps more, who want to just go along to get along. Men tend to be more conflict avoidant, as I'll demonstrate shortly. Parents still to this day use less emotion words with men than they do with boys when they're raising them than they do with girls. Therefore, men come into marriage much less well equipped to advocate for themselves using their emotions. For most men, their wives are not only their best friends, but in many cases, their only friends. So the cost to men of really upsetting their wives is enormous. So this is one of the reasons that I think that this can be much more likely to happen with sons and with daughters. So I think it's helpful to do kind of a 10,000 feet up right now and kind of just talk about the state of men and women in our society today, just to be kind of thorough about it. So for today, women, at least those in heterosexual marriages, are currently still doing twice the amount of childcare and twice the amount of housework compared with men, including women in full-time employment. Men after marriage do less housework than when they were single, while women do even more, especially when they become mothers. Women are also more likely to carry the emotional burdens of extended network of family and friends, to keep track of birthdays, gifts, and crises, and to respond with cards, calls, and outreach, a task that sociologists call kin keeping. So while this orientation has the potential to make for deep and lasting relationships with friends or family, sociologists Ronald Kessler and Jane McLeod observe that this effort takes an emotional toll when it involves helping loved ones manage stressful life events. In those cases, what they call a cost of caring leaves women more vulnerable to depression, anxiety, and burnout, a reality from which men are often insulated. So while men arguably love their wives as much as their wives love them, in some cases, maybe even more, men's identities are less oriented around care work per se, and more commonly around achievement, self-direction, and status, as a survey of men and women in 68 countries confirmed in 2009. And because they're less oriented around relationships and caretaking, they don't suffer the same kind of cost emotionally if they decide to limit, restrict, or even end relationships with their parents. Now, I'm not suggesting that they experience none of it. I just think that there's a differential between what men experience and what women experience that makes men more likely to give in for all the reasons that I've given so far. But the stereotype of the self-centered and clueless male paints a pale portrait of what many men experience these days. It also ignores the cost paid by men, pressure to prize status, and invulnerability over connection. For example, men account for almost 3 out of 4 deaths of despair, as the economist Agnes Deaton and Ann Case put it, either from a suicide or an overdose, especially from those down the economic ladder. Many men feel rudderless today since the role of provider and protector is no longer the same kind of pathway to identity that it once was. So men who lack the ability to provide or protect or significantly contribute to the family are psychologically the least likely to be able to offer their wives the kind of vulnerable, emotional, and collaborative support that predicts today's marriages. They're also much less likely to be able to stand up to their wives if they're feeling overly pressured by them to give up relationships with their parents. They're more likely to retreat into anger, addiction, or internet use. So, as I mentioned earlier, some of these differences begin in childhood because parents tend to talk less about their feelings than they do to boys than they do to girls. Girls start talking at a much younger age. The psychology Thomas Joyner found that overall boys are more secretive with their parents than our girls and are less responsive to and inclusive of their mothers. So as Joyner said, the fact that when the genders are combined into one group, gender rises to the top as a predictor of speech frequency, even beyond a personality characteristic. We say that shows how important it is. So consider the following statistics, and then I'll get back into the topic of daughters-in-laws and in particular. But consider the following statistics just to shine a bright light on these differences. Girls are about a year ahead of boys these days in terms of reading ability in OECD nations, while the advantage for boys in math is increasingly shrinking. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to fail at math, reading, and science. Girls are more likely to graduate from high school. While the Ivy League colleges in the US were always predominantly male, every one of them today is majority female. Women account for around half the managerial positions in the US economy. Many previously male-dominated professions, including medicine and financial management, are rapidly tilting female, especially younger professionals. Proportion of women lawyers has increased tenfold from 4% in 1980 to 43% in 2020. Now, that isn't to say that complete parity has been reached across the board. Only 1 in 5 executive level companies directors is a woman, and of the Fortune 500 firms, just 44 have a female CEO. But so at the upper reaches of the economy, there's a lot more room for women to expand. But the further you progress down the economic ladder, it's men who are struggling far more than women. And these kind of dynamics can bleed into marital relations as well, which is why I'm raising them. Okay, so getting back into the specific topic of sons of daughters-in-law. So from my perspective, there's a continuum of relating to one's in-laws that goes from kind of normal, expectable conflicts and disruptions to those that are less expectable and more problematic, even dysfunctional and pathological. So probably the majority of you are dealing with some that are more on the pathological side in terms of in-laws, even though they may have started out being triggered by more normal or expectable incidents. So to be the most useful to you, it's important for us to look at it from 3 different angles: from your angle as a parent, from the angle of your estranged child, and from the perspective of the person that they're married or cohabiting with. If we start from your perspective, I know that some of you have gotten married or had children without even sending you a notice. You read about it somewhere or heard about it from a friend, which is not only heartbreaking, but humiliating to not know it and to be exposed to it in that way. Many of you who've been very dedicated parents feel ripped off, heartbroken, enraged, and those are all completely understandable feelings. For some of you, I know it's been going on for years. When a kid does cut off a parent from a wedding or the birth of a child, or from a very involved relationship with a grandchild, they're drawing a pretty serious line in the sand. So it's reasonable for a parent to wonder, is there ever going to be any chance to reconcile? But my experience is not always, but that often when parents do a lot of the principles that I recommend, that a reconciliation can still be possible. So if we look at it from a parent's perspective, when our kids get married or become serious about somebody, if we were crazy about that person, great. But if we're not, then we might have a bunch of concerns that we feel tempted to voice. When we might feel like, well, is the person that my kid is getting serious about, are they going to be respectful or nice to me? Are they going to treat my kid well? Are they going to take their life off of a cliff? What if I don't like them? How are their parents going to treat us? Are we going to be less of a priority than the other spouse's parents? How do we handle our negative reactions to our future daughter or son-in-law or current daughter-in-law or son-in-law? Did my kid marry the wrong person? Since parents are older, they often have pretty good ideas about whether or not the kid is about to get involved with somebody or commit themselves to somebody who's really could have a very negative impact on their life and well-being. So I hear from a lot of parents that it was actually the act of warning their child that, maybe, I don't know, the fact that your husband-to-be is a former felon and this is his fifth marriage and he's still dealing drugs. I don't know. Do you think it's such a good choice? Even that level of questioning triggered the child getting upset, mad, and defensive and rushing into the arms of that person that they were involved with. So as you can see, there's plenty of potential for conflict and for a parent to step on somebody's toes, even in a normal pre-estranged situation. So whenever you begin to bring two families together, it's like you're bringing two different tribes or cultures together, even if you're same socioeconomic level, religion, ethnicity, etc. It increases the chance for conflict, potential engagement, disruptive and hurt feelings, because you're bringing together cultures that sometimes can't relate to each other, even if they're very similar in all those ways. So I'll come back to that. But if you look at it from your child's perspective, what I really want you to be mindful of is the role that choosing a spouse is an expression of their own identity and individuality. Nowhere is it more true that when our kids decide who to marry or couple with, that they're engaging in an act of identity and personal expression. What could be more personal or an act of expression than saying, this is who I love, this is who I don't, I like this kind of woman or man, this speaks to my taste, I don't like these qualities, I like these. It's probably the single most important of personal expression and choice that a person can make. And in terms of the family system, it also brings into the open the following questions for the young adult, your child. Well, even when they're dating, will my parents like or dislike this person that I'm in love with and thinking about marrying or married? How will I feel about that? What will I do if they don't like them? What will that mean to me? Will this person like or dislike my parents? How am I going to feel about that? And what will I do about that if they don't like them? What will that mean to me? Are they similar to my parents in terms of religion, ethnicity, class, or culture, or are they really different? Are they completely opposite, have little to nothing in common with them, and are coming from these completely different worlds? So early on, the seeds of conflict and estrangement may be sown when your child first falls in love with somebody or decides to couple with a person who may be in their lives forever. Recall that in my survey of 1,600 parents, the vast majority didn't become estranged until after the kid got married. So when first dating, the adult child might ask the parent, gee, what do you think about, my new person or my fiance or whatever? And if the parent raises some kind of reasonable doubt about their drinking or their temper or their rudeness to them, then your child may believe that you're questioning their taste and judgment. Well, you may be, but not in the biggest sense of the word, but certainly here. But paradoxically, that may actually cause them to rush into the arms of the other person as a way to kind of express a kind of rebellious independence. In other words, because it steps on the toes of their ability to choose for themselves, they may feel obligated to embrace the other person more to reassure themselves that they get to decide at that point than because they're really clear that they've just met Mr. or Mrs. Right. Now, I really want to emphasize the role and importance of the child doing some form of personal expression, demonstrating to you and the world that they're their own person and they can make their own choices. Remember, today, nothing compels an adult child to have a relationship with a parent beyond that adult child's desire to have a relationship with a parent. So, um, so if you say things or do things that step on your child's toes in that sense, then you're moving yourself one step closer to either a permanent estrangement or the greater likelihood of an estrangement. So, if your child says, for example, screw you, I get to choose who I want, it's a little like the teenager who'd rather shoot himself in the foot by getting bad grades in order to remind himself and everybody else that it's his foot to shoot. He doesn't see in the rebellion that he's doing something that's inherently self-destructive. Now, remember what I'm describing as a kind of rebellious independence, that one of the things that's happened over the past 4 decades or so is that adulthood has been extended much further out. In the 1960s, for example, the vast majority of people could consider themselves an adult by their early to mid 20s by the fact that they were married, they had a home, they were self-supporting, and they had children. Now, those things, if they're to be achieved at all, typically don't happen till kids are in their late 20s or 30s. So from that perspective, the relationship with the parent as a kind of a metric of whether or not I'm an adult has become much more important, because you don't have these institutional external markers of adulthood. It has to be these much more psychological interior markers of adulthood. So the more immature your kid, the more undeveloped they are, the less confidence they have, the less they've achieved in their life, the less they can look at themselves and say, look, I'm a fully functioning adult. I don't need mom or dad. They get to have their opinions, but it's not going to kill me. I really know who I am. The more vulnerable they are to having to push up against you to really prove to themselves. Okay, well, let's look at this from the perspective of your son-in-law or daughter-in-law. In general, the more you can really understand that person, ideally with compassion, the more that you get them, the better you're going to be able to intervene in ways or behave in ways that's going to either increase the likelihood of a reconciliation or improve the relationship. You don't have to adore your son-in-law or daughter-in-law, but you do have to understand them. Because if you don't, then you're really in problematic territory. So, if we look at it from the normal expectable conflicts that often happen in families, even in a perfectly healthy son or daughter-in-law, it may have started with concerns about how their future in-laws are going to feel about them, particularly somebody who's really insecure. Are they going to like me? Will they be too busy and intrusive? Will my partner prioritize their needs over mine? This might be particularly true with an insecure spouse, where the son in particular was really close to the parents. So will they tell me how to parent or how to keep my house? Will they tell me how to treat their adult child that I'm married to or marrying? There's a lot of funny scenes in shows like Everybody Loves Raymond or other movies where the mother-in-law tells the daughter-in-law how to cook the son's favorite meal or how to keep house or any of these things, and how the daughter-in-law feels incredibly intruded on in that way. So these are kind of normal, expectable, potential conflicts, particularly between daughters-in-laws and mothers-in-laws. In many ways, that's potentially the most fraught of all the relationships in family. And that's why the family history of the daughter-in-law is so important. The way to think about that is whatever her issues with her own parents, there's a good chance she's going to have them with you. She felt over-controlled by her parents. There's a good chance she's going to view you as being overly controlling. She felt rejected, devalued, and abandoned by her parents. She may view you also in that way. Completely react to something that you do or say and convince your child that you as parents are much more critical and rejecting than your child realize. Now, also, if she's estranged from her own parents, she's more likely to push her child in that direction. So you can see how this works. When our children marry somebody, they're not only marrying that particular person, they're marrying the psychology of that person and the family relationships that have been built up over the years in that person's unconscious. They're marrying that person's relationship to other people in the world. They're marrying that person's their sensitivities, their vulnerabilities, and the way that they're immature, unresolved, undeveloped, problematic, or even, unfortunately, as many of you know, psychologically disturbed. So the more that parents understand these things, the better they're able to navigate the often treacherous terrain of having to deal with somebody who sometimes has a knife to your kid's throat saying, choose your parents or me, you can't have both. Now, often when a baby arrives, that's when there's an increase in anxiety, particularly on the start of the daughter-in-law, which often leads to stress. Estrangements often occur once there's a pregnancy or a baby. That's when you start getting limits set on how often you can visit, how you have to behave when you visit, how you're going to handle the baby, what their expectations of you are, what you can and cannot do. You might not have even been invited to the birth if you were not estranged at that point, because but maybe your daughter-in-law's parents were invited. Maybe you're not invited even to see the baby for a while, even if you're in contact with the child. And I know a lot of you haven't had any contact, or were super involved with your grandchildren, and then as a result of a conflict, either with your child or their spouse, are completely cut off. And tragically, estrangements are typically not dyadic. They're typically fracture whole family systems. So when parents get cut off from their adult child, typically their grandchildren get cut off as well. So daughters-in-law worry that basically that the in-laws will interfere with her ability to parent, her values, and her authority in the household. They worry that they're going to be diminished in their own household, and they won't be able to say, look, this is my house, my children, I get to do it the way I want. And so that worry and that anxiety may make the daughter-in-law particularly reactive or overreactive to any comment made by either parent, and put your child into a loyalty bind where he or she feels torn between you as parents and his spouse. So my experience, these dynamics may be particularly true in those homes where the adult child, particularly sons, were very close to the parents. In those situations, the daughter-in-law may be especially worried that the son's going to defer to his parents rather than to her. And that may cause her to exaggerate her complaints, such as, well, I don't like how your mom holds the baby or the bottle or that kind of thing. Now, it happens a lot with sons-in-laws too. I'm not saying it's 90%, it's a daughter-in-law issue. But it certainly seems like it's more often with the daughter-in-law for all the reasons that I gave earlier about the way that men can behave in marriage. So, it gets back to the issue of adult children, your child really needing to say this, in protection of his wife, of his own autonomy, of his own identity, of his own individuality, being able to see that, this is my life, I get to set the terms. So keeping that model in mind, the daughter-in-law can become a good engine in terms of individuality, of saying, I'm my own person, this is my own family, nobody's going to tell me what to do or how to do it, especially when a baby arrives. Because when adult children become parents, they've arrived into territory that we no longer as parents can uniquely claim as ours. If there's anything that symbolizes the arrival into adulthood and the displacement of the parent as having a unique role, is becoming a parent yourself. Once that occurs, you're doing things that your parent can no longer uniquely claim to be the ultimate authority on. Often adult children become very demanding and difficult around the parent around just this issue. So, particularly an adult child has a lot of complaints about how they were raised. They may use that also as a way to estrange the parent and say, well, I don't trust you around my children because of how you treated me, which is the topic of a different webinar. In cultures where there's arranged marriages, for example, one of the interesting things is that those marriages tend to actually have higher levels of satisfaction, in part because they're made because the parents of both sides get together and make sure that they like the other parents and the spouse, and then it's an appropriate match for the kid. They actually have some say over it. They also have more laws against divorce typically in those cultures, but their marital satisfaction is actually higher than it is in the US. So we obviously do not have that power here. We're the opposite of that kind of a culture and parents haven't had that power since like the mid 18th century or so. So as a result, our kids can make some terrible decisions and parents are damned as a result of it. So Your child might have married somebody who's just a lot stronger than they are. You can maybe this sweet, happy go lucky kid and married a bulldozer, somebody who's going to say, look, this is how we're doing it. This is where we're living. This is when your parents can come over or not. I don't like your parents and I don't like how you are when they're around. So too bad, choose me or them. They may have very rigid ideas about family, how things should be done, even if they're not necessarily mentally ill. They may come from a family that's a much more closed system and view you as in-laws as complete intruders. They may pull your child into the family castle and pull up the gate behind them. So I've talked to a lot of estranged parents where the in-laws are almost like a cult in terms of their desire to exclude the parents from anything. They welcome your kid into the family, but that's it. And then it's very hard to get at your child because the walls go up and your kid gets pulled into that. So that may be true in families that aren't necessarily diagnosable, but who can still create a lot of pain and chaos nonetheless. On the other hand, as I probably made clear thus far, some daughters-in-law come from very dysfunctional families, and they can project onto you all of their unresolved conflicts that they've had with their own families. So somebody who was abused or controlled by their parents when they were growing up may wrongly view you that way and make your kid miserable if she or she tries to stay close to you, or even posits a different interpretation of who you are as people. So that view of you of being like their parents may cause them to completely overreact to you, to take personal interactions that were very well intended on your part, or with a healthier person, what might be considered annoying, but forgivable. In this kind of a dynamic, this person latches onto it and makes it be completely unforgivable. They make it a gripe, and it becomes a rallying cry to your estranged adult child that you're a gaslighter, toxic, difficult, narcissistic, disturbed, and your child just doesn't see it. The fact that they don't see it just means that they're weak. So as I've said, sons are particularly vulnerable to this kind of, humiliation, being called a mama's boy or weak or ineffective or that kind of thing. So, a lot of people are vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. If you've ever been in a troubled romantic relationship, you know how much you can be tied in knots by that person. And there's no more hellish marriage than living with somebody who's really disturbed. So if your kid is married to somebody who, say, has borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, or they're a psychopath, or they're paranoid, or even if they have such severe depression or anxiety that they can't tolerate any disruption and their orientation is so much toward making themselves feel safe and not anxious or upset, that may cause them to not want anybody in their midst that will create those feelings in them. So if somebody has that kind of a profile, it doesn't take very much for those types of feelings to get triggered. Typically with compassion, those people are not happy people. Happy people overall tend to be more tolerant, forgiving, and loving. It's typically those who are really unhappy that are more reactive, difficult, and disturbed. They construct the world in such a way to make themselves feel safe. So the way they make themselves feel safe and comfortable is to quickly rid themselves of anyone who in any way challenges their perspective or their comfort. Thus, the most insignificant interaction can cause that person to become triggered, to become self-righteous, preoccupied, and inflamed. So all of these things can lead to a potential estrangement or put the parent on the estrangement track. Now, on the other hand, this diagnosis may sadly describe your child. I work with parents who blamed the daughter-in-law when it was actually their son who was the bigger part of the problem. Your son may be the one, or your daughter, if your son listening to this because you have a son-in-law issue, but your child may have psychological issues even if they're well parented that make him or her unable to withstand the normal and expectable slings and arrows of adult life and family interaction. They might be too sensitive, depressed, anxious, insecure, or just too troubled to handle the normal expectable slings and arrows that happen in every family. They may need to gang up with their spouse and their spouse's family against you as a way to feel more insulated from the normal conflicts that come from expectable parent-child interactions. So that fragility may mean that they have to construct the world in an overly simplistic fashion, that people are either with me or they're against me. So that's why sometimes in estrangement, the adult child not only cuts off the parents, but anybody related to the parents, even revered grandparents, aunts and uncles. Now, why would they need to do that? Well, it's because their view of themselves is so fragile. And, the motivated, troubled cult of one's son-in-law or daughter-in-law can also make this happen. But if your child is doing it, it's because their view of themselves is so fragile that they can't tolerate anybody challenging it and saying something like, well, I don't know, your mom and dad aren't so bad. I remember them growing up. They're good people. I don't think you're being fair to them. Give them another chance. What did they do that was so bad? There may also be other siblings who grew up in the same household and witness the parents and can testify that the child's orientation and perspective of the parents is very distorted and isn't a view that they share. So, if you're at all familiar with my writing, you know that I'm a believer in separate realities, and it's an important orientation to have. Um, and a separate realities basically says that you can have a family of 5 people, and each person's going to have a different perspective on who people are in the family and what even occurred. It's like the Kurosawa movie Rashomon, where you get different people witnessing a crime and they get very different reports of what happened. Well, families are very much like that as well. So um, having a separate realities orientation is useful because it can make you feel more compassionate for people who have a different perspective. So, for example, your adult child says, well, you were emotionally abusive of me. A parent could feel like, look, objectively, I was a great parent. But the child could feel like there were things that happened in the family that were really hurtful to them. And that's why it's never useful for a parent to simply say, no, I wasn't emotionally abusive to you. It's far better for the parent to say, well, it's clear that I had blind spots, that I wasn't aware that I was behaving in ways that felt abusive to you. And I'm glad that you let me know. So I'm talking about the issue of separate realities because sometimes the people, whether it's our children or the people that they marry, who look the most strong are actually the most fragile. Sometimes people who can look arrogant or aggressive and domineering, there's actually a fragility under that, or they wouldn't need to display it in quite that way. People who are truly confident and happy don't walk around devaluing other people, criticizing them, showing their superiority. They have an inherent sense of their value. So what's key to understand these dynamics is that your adult child's ability to manage conflict with you is probably impaired. If they were able to manage conflict with you, they would tell you, not only with you, but with their spouse. They'd be able to tell you what their complaints are. A lot of these kids don't. And you should listen if they do, and take responsibility and empathize. But the ability to manage conflict in their marriage is also a big issue, that they're not strong enough to say, look, you don't have to like my parents or love my parents, but don't tell me I can't see them, and don't tell me my kids can't see them. I'm sorry, I'm just not going to accept those terms. That's not reasonable. And with you, they could tell you their complaints about you in a straightforward way as well. But a lot of people who become estranged because they can't manage their conflicts, and so they just go inside, or they shut down, or they withdraw. Well, so in summary, I want to talk about, sort of just to emphasize the main things to keep in mind with if you're going through this. The first thing to keep in mind is that your son-in-law or your daughter-in-law is the gatekeeper, not only to your adult child, but also to your grandchildren. Nothing is going to happen without their approval. And the more troubled they are, the harder you're going to have to work. So it's useful, if you've written a amends letter to your child, to also write one to your daughter-in-law or son-in-law. Now, why would you do that? A lot of parents feel like, well, why would I do that? They're the main cause of the problem. Aren't I strengthening them? Aren't I emboldening them? Well, you do it in large part to strengthen the hand of your child, so that your child can say, and your conflict avoidant child can say, look, I think my parents are really trying. Those letters aren't easy to write. Why don't we reach out to them? Why don't we, let them know that we appreciate that letter? Because it gives him a vehicle to push back. Otherwise, the troubled daughter-in-law can just say, well, your parents, they don't care about me. All they care about is getting access to my children. And it's not good for my mental health. So I don't want to let them into my life, and I don't let them into your life, and you should be prioritizing my feelings. So you want to make it as easy as possible on your adult child. So if you have criticized them, this daughter-in-law, you want to work very, very hard to repair that. You want to talk, if your son is talking to you, but your daughter-in-law isn't, you might see if he'd be open to talking with you and giving you advice about what to do or what to say. Finally, you cannot go around your daughter-in-law. You can only go through them. So it's, unless they encourage it, you can't have a separate piece. And second of all, or last of all, you should, if you're reaching out, if you're sending gifts to your own child, make sure you're also sending them to the daughter-in-law as well. Okay, well, those are the main principles. I hope that this was helpful, and I look forward to seeing you on other webinars.